The four of them had her cornered, their shapes like jagged monoliths against the bruised purple of the Afghan dusk. They had followed her out from the wire, beyond the last concertina fence of the combat outpost, into the treacherous gray space between worlds. They were Marines, hard-faced and confident, moving with the predatory swagger that came with being the biggest wolves in this particular valley. She was just a shadow, a technician in sterile fatigues who had no business being out here. The air was thick with the scent of crushed sage and their contempt. Their leader, a corporal with a jaw like a brick, took a step forward, his M4 held loosely, casually. He spat a wad of tobacco juice near her boot. "Lost, little bird?" he had asked, the question a coiled snake. She had not answered. She had simply shifted her weight, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, a leaf adjusting to a change in the wind. 39 seconds later, the corporal was a heap on the ground, his rifle disassembled into its core components beside his unconscious form. The other three lay in a neat, symmetrical pattern around her, groaning, each disarmed and neutralized with a brutal, almost surgical economy of motion. She had not drawn a weapon, she had not raised her voice, she had simply been. And when the patrol from the COP finally arrived, drawn by the sudden silence where shouts should have been, they found her standing alone in the twilight, her breathing as calm and steady as a sleeping child's, the only one left standing. Forward operating base. Nightingale baked under the hammer of the Kandahar sun. The air was a physical weight, a shimmering blanket woven from dust, diesel fumes, and the faint metallic tang of latent violence. It smelled of sun-scorched steel and overworked generators. The ground was a fine talcum-like powder that invaded every crease of fabric, every pore of skin, a constant gritty reminder of the hostile land they occupied. The base was a city of gravel and HESCO barriers, a testament to humanity's stubborn ability to carve out a pocket of order in the heart of chaos. Within its walls, a different kind of order reigned, one dictated by rank, reputation, and the unwritten laws of warrior cultures. At the center of this social gravity was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. He was a mountain of a man, carved from granite and indignation, with a voice that seemed to start not in his chest, but in the very bedrock of the FOB. He was Force Recon, a fact he broadcasted not with insignia, which were muted and professional, but with his entire being. His posture was a declaration of dominance, his every gesture a performance for the chorus of younger, impressionable Marines who orbited him like moons around a roaring, angry planet. He held court near the CrossFit rig, his laughter a percussive force that echoed off the concrete blast walls, a sound that demanded attention and received it without question. His world was simple, a binary code of strength and weakness, of predators and prey. He was a predator, and he made sure everyone knew it. And then there was Specialist Anya Rostova. She was the anomaly, the glitch in Thorne's binary code. While he was a roaring bonfire, she was the stillness of deep space. She worked in the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, a windowless, climate-controlled box where the digital ghosts of the war were cataloged and analyzed. When she was outside that box, she moved through the FOB with a quiet purpose that many mistook for timidity. She was of average height, with a frame that seemed almost frail next to the hulking figures of the combat-armed soldiers. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, often partially obscured by the dark lenses of her ballistic glasses, was a neutral mask. She was seen, but not noticed. A background element, a librarian accidentally shelved in an armory. Her focus was typically on a data tablet or a complex wiring diagram, her fingers moving with a deftness that was almost hypnotic. She walked with her eyes down, not out of deference, but out of observation, tracking the subtle shifts in the gravel, the wear patterns on equipment, the language of a world composed of physics and probabilities. To men like Thorne, she was invisible until she was in the way. Her silence was not the respectful quiet of a subordinate, but something other. Something self-contained and absolute. It was the silence of a deep well, and it unnerved him on a primal level he couldn't articulate. He saw weakness, a mouse scurrying along the edges of a lion's den. He did not see the coiled potential, the quiet lethality of a viper hiding in plain sight. The armory was Thorne's church, and he was its high priest. The air inside was cool and sacred, smelling of hops number 9 and well-oiled steel. Racks of M4s and M249s stood in silent, orderly rows. It was a place of power, a sanctuary of controlled violence, and today it was violated. Specialist Rostova was there, kneeling before an open Pelican case that contained not a rifle, but a tangled nest of fiber optic cables and microprocessing boards. It was the central diagnostic unit for the new Cerberus perimeter defense system, a network of seismic, acoustic, and thermal sensors that were supposed to be the FOB's invisible shield. She was running a baseline diagnostic, her fingers tracing a glowing line of code on her tablet, her focus so complete that the world around her seemed to have faded to gray. Thorne entered with his retinue of 2 corporals and a lance corporal, their collective presence sucking the quiet out of the room. He stopped dead, his boots grinding on the concrete floor. His shadow fell over her, a sudden eclipse. "What the hell is this?" he boomed, his voice a battering ram against the stillness. The sound was designed to startle, to intimidate, to assert ownership of the space. Rostova did not flinch. She did not look up. She completed the command string on her tablet, her fingers swiping with surgical precision. A small green light on the unit blinked in confirmation. Only then did she slowly raise her head, her eyes, shielded by the dark glasses, giving away nothing. "Running a system integrity check, Gunnery Sergeant," she stated. Her voice was calm, a flat line on a heart monitor, utterly devoid of inflection or emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, offered as if she were reading from a technical manual. The lack of a startled jump or a stammered apology was fuel on Thorne's fire. He craved the jolt of fear, the tacit admission of his authority. Her placid response was a denial of his power, an act of passive rebellion he could not tolerate. He took a step closer, looming over her. "I don't remember giving a pog permission to play with her toys in my house," he sneered, using the derogatory term for non-infantry personnel. His corporals chuckled on cue, a well-rehearsed chorus. "This is a place for warriors, sweetheart, not for IT. This toy is the central nervous system for the sensors that tell your warriors what to shoot at," she replied, her tone still unnervingly level. She began to pack the delicate components back into their foam cutouts, her movements economical and precise. There was no wasted motion, no hint of nervousness. Each action was deliberate, as if she were disarming a bomb. This factual, almost pedantic correction was more infuriating than any curse word would have been. It was an appeal to logic in a place he ruled with pure emotion and intimidation. He felt his face flush with heat. He wanted to knock the tablet from her hand, to see her composure finally crack. "You got a smart mouth, librarian," he growled, leaning down, invading her personal space. He could smell the faint, clean scent of antiseptic soap, a stark contrast to the sweat and grime of his own world. "You need to learn your place. When men are talking, you listen. When men are working, you get out of the way. Now, pack up your science fair project and get out of my armory before you break a nail." Rostova paused her work. She slowly, deliberately, turned her head to face him fully. She lifted her glasses and set them carefully on top of the case. Her eyes were a pale, crystalline gray, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. They were utterly flat, holding no fear, no anger, no deference. They were the eyes of a camera, recording data. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, a silence that stretched into an uncomfortable eternity for the onlookers. In that silence, she measured him. She saw the slight tremor in his jaw, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his weight was unevenly distributed, favoring his right leg. She processed it all as simple data points. Then, without a word, she lowered her gaze back to her work, placed her glasses back on her nose, and closed the lid of the Pelican case. The latches snapped shut with a series of sharp, final clicks. She stood, the case in one hand, her tablet in the other. She did not acknowledge him further. She simply turned and walked towards the door, her footsteps making no sound on the dusty concrete. Her utter dismissal, the complete lack of emotional reaction, was the ultimate insult. It was as if he were a piece of furniture she had to navigate around. It denied him the confrontation he sought, leaving his aggression hanging in the air, impotent and foolish. As she walked past him, he felt an irrational surge of fury. He had been challenged and defeated without a single shot being fired. He was left standing in his own church, a god ignored by a passing ghost, and the quiet, sycophantic laughter of his subordinates suddenly sounded hollow and mocking in his ears. He stared at the empty doorway through which she had disappeared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He had not won. He had been handled. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a flicker. On the main tactical display in the command center, a segment of the FOB's northern perimeter went dark. It was Section Gamma 7, a treacherous stretch of wadis and broken rock formations that offered a natural, concealed approach to the wire. The icons representing the Cerberus sensors, acoustic, seismic, thermal, vanished from the map, replaced by a single pulsing red question mark. The invisible shield was down. Colonel Vance stood before the screen, his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled concern. He was a lean, wiry man whose quiet authority was the antithesis of Thorne's bluster. He did not need to raise his voice. His silence carried more weight than a platoon of screaming drill instructors. Beside him, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer Erickson watched the screen with the unblinking focus of a hawk. Erickson was on the FOB for a cross-training exercise, a quiet professional who observed everything and said little. "Report," Vance commanded, his voice a low rumble. A young lieutenant, his face pale, stammered, "Sir, we've lost the entire Gamma 7 array. The master junction box J7 is non-responsive. It's gone." "Gone is not a diagnosis, Lieutenant," Vance said, his tone cutting like a shard of ice. "What's its physical status?" "We don't know, sir. It could be an equipment failure, or it could be hostile action." The implication hung heavy in the air-conditioned chill of the command center. An enemy who could disable their most advanced surveillance system without triggering a single alarm was an enemy to be feared. They were blind. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, summoned to the TOC, saw his opportunity. He strode into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. "Colonel," he announced, his voice booming with confidence, "my team can handle this. We'll run a patrol out to J7, assess the damage, and get eyes on that dead space. We're already geared up." Vance turned his gaze to Thorne. It was a look that stripped away ego and pretension, leaving only the raw facts of a man's capabilities. "This isn't a simple patrol, Gunny. That area is a kill zone. If the enemy is smart enough to take down the array, they're smart enough to have set a trap on the approach." "With all due respect, sir, that's what Force Recon does," Thorne boasted, a smirk playing on his lips. "We walk into traps and walk back out. My men are the best. We'll be in and out before the enemy knows we're there." He was performing again, this time for the highest-ranking officer on the base. This was his chance to reassert the dominance that the quiet specialist had so thoroughly undermined. From the corner of the room, a voice, calm and factual, cut through Thorne's bravado. "Sending a full squad is a tactical error." All heads turned. It was Specialist Rostova. She stood near a server rack, a diagnostic handset in her hand, having been summoned to analyze the system's ghost data. She hadn't been part of the conversation, yet she spoke with an air of finality. Thorne's face contorted with rage. For her to challenge him here, in front of the colonel, was an unthinkable breach of protocol and hierarchy. "Specialist," he snarled, "no one is paying you to think. Stick to your circuit boards." Rostova ignored him, her attention fixed on Colonel Vance. "The junction box is located in a natural choke point. The seismic data logs from the adjacent sensors show minute, rhythmic tremors consistent with digging less than 20 meters from the box approximately 3 hours ago. The acoustic sensors were disabled first, followed by the thermals, and finally the main power line was severed. It was a professional job. Any large force approach will be channeled directly into a prepared ambush. A 4-man fire team is a large force. It's a target." Her analysis was so precise, so devoid of guesswork, that it silenced the room. She spoke of the battlefield not in terms of courage or aggression, but as a problem of physics and data. Thorne, however, saw it only as a personal attack. "So what's your brilliant plan, Specialist? We send a damn drone? We ask the enemy nicely to turn our gear back on?" Colonel Vance held up a hand, silencing Thorne before he could continue. He looked at Rostova, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "What do you recommend, Specialist?" "A single operator," she said without hesitation. "Minimal gear, minimal signature. Someone who can read the terrain and understands the system architecture. They need to get to the box, diagnose the physical fault, and either repair it on site or bug it and exfiltrate without being detected. Thorne burst into a derisive laugh. A single operator out there? That's a suicide mission. Who are you going to send? A ghost? His words were meant to be a killing blow to her absurd suggestion, a final public humiliation. But Colonel Vance didn't laugh. His gaze remained locked on Rostova, his expression hardening into one of pure, cold decision. He looked from the pulsing red icon on the screen to the quiet woman standing before him, and then to the loud, arrogant gunnery sergeant. He saw the problem, and he saw the solution. "Your point is noted, Gunny," Vance said, his voice dangerously soft. "But your mission is scrubbed. Stand your men down." He then turned his full attention back to Rostova. "Specialist, get your kit, you're up." The command center fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the hum of the servers. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the confident smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated disbelief. He had offered his sword, his strength, his warriors, and the colonel had chosen the librarian. Thorne's attempt to recover the situation was a disaster painted in broad, clumsy strokes of ego. He couldn't accept the colonel's decision, arguing that his team was being sidelined, that protocol dictated a combat unit handle the kinetic problem. He convinced a reluctant Vance to allow him to take his team out, not to the junction box itself, but to establish an overwatch position on a nearby ridge. It was a compromise, a foolish concession to a bruised ego, and Vance knew it. Thorne's mission was to observe and report, to provide cover only if absolutely necessary. It was a leash, but Thorne saw it as a vindication. He led his four-man team out with a performative swagger, their movements loud and overly aggressive. They were a hammer, and to them, the entire valley looked like a nail. They reached the designated ridge, a crumbling spine of rock overlooking the wadi where the junction box was hidden. From his vantage point, using high-powered optics, Thorne could just make out the gray metal box nestled in a cleft of rock. It looked undisturbed, pristine. His radio crackled. "Watchman 1, this is Archangel. Overwatch is in position. The objective appears clear. No sign of hostile activity." He made sure his voice was laced with a hint of, "I told you so." Then, the world broke. The first sign was not a sound, but a feeling, a deep, resonant thump that traveled through the rock and into the bones of his men. Before anyone could process it, a geyser of earth and rock erupted 50 feet to their left, the delayed roar of the IED catching up a split second later. It was a bait charge, meant to draw their attention. As their heads swiveled towards the explosion, the real attack began. A machine gun opened up from a concealed position across the wadi, its rounds stitching a deadly line across their cover. Simultaneously, rifle fire erupted from at least 3 other points. They were perfectly triangulated, caught in a textbook L-shaped ambush. Thorne's men reacted with the brutal efficiency of their training, returning fire, seeking better cover. But they were pinned. The enemy fire was precise, disciplined. It wasn't the spray and pray of local insurgents. This was something else. Every time one of his Marines tried to shift position, a burst of gunfire would kick up dust exactly where he intended to go. The enemy knew the terrain. They had prepared this ground. Thorne's arrogance had led them straight into the killing jar he had been warned about. He was on the radio, his voice no longer booming, but tight with adrenaline and a rising tide of panic. "Archangel, this is Watchman 1. We are engaged, pinned down, multiple positions, requesting immediate support." His performance had failed. He had taken his team into the trap, and the trap had sprung. He had proven Rostova right in the most catastrophic way possible. His men were bleeding. His authority was shattered. All he had left was the desperate metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Back in the TOC, the chaos of Thorne's contact report was a frantic symphony of shouting and static. Colonel Vance listened, his face grim, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. He had allowed his judgment to be swayed, and now Marines were paying the price. Anya Rostova stood beside the main communications hub, wearing a minimalist plate carrier over her sterile fatigues. She held a helmet in the crook of her arm. She hadn't put it on yet. She listened to the radio traffic, her expression unchanging. She was processing the cadence of the machine gun fire, the intervals between the rifle reports, the strained tenor of Thorne's voice. It was all data. Chief Erickson, the SEAL, materialized at her side. He had been observing her since the initial briefing. His professional curiosity piqued. He saw none of the fear or frantic energy that gripped the rest of the room. He saw only a deep, unnerving calm. He held out a weapon. It was not a standard-issue M4. It was a Honey Badger PDW, a compact, integrally suppressed rifle known for its stealth and lethality in close quarters. It was a specialist's tool. "You might need this," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not an order, but an offering from one professional to another, a quiet acknowledgement of her competence. Rostova looked at the weapon, then at Erickson. She took it from him, her hands moving with an easy familiarity that belied her role as a technician. She checked the action, slapped the magazine home, and felt its balance. It was a perfectly weighted instrument. She gave him a single, brief nod. It was all the thanks he needed. She turned to Colonel Vance. "Permission to proceed, sir." Vance looked at her, then at the tactical map where Thorne's position was flashing red. He saw the fire vectors of the enemy, the trap laid bare. He saw the ghost he needed. "Permission granted, Rostova. Go." The crowd of operators gathered in the TOC watched her leave. They were silent, a mixture of awe and disbelief on their faces. They had expected failure, a foolish gesture. But the quiet confidence she projected, the silent endorsement from the SEAL chief, and the colonel's unwavering command had shifted the atmosphere. They were no longer expecting her to fail. They were waiting to see what impossible thing she would do next. She moved like water. The terrain that had channeled Thorne's team into a death trap was, for her, a landscape of opportunity. She did not walk on the paths, she flowed through the spaces in between. Her steps were silent, her body held low, using every shadow, every rock, every fold in the earth as an extension of herself. The honey badger was a part of her, not a tool she carried. She moved with a preternatural awareness, her head constantly swiveling, her eyes scanning not for threats but for patterns. Heat, shimmer, disturbed earth, unnatural silence. To the thermal imaging drone circling high overhead, she was a fleeting cool spot, a ghost in the machine. She approached the ambush site from the south, downwind, with the setting sun at her back. She didn't head for Thorne's position. That was the focal point of the enemy's attention. She headed for the machine gun nest that had them pinned. It was the linchpin of the enemy's strategy. She stalked it for 10 minutes, circling, observing. 2 men, well camouflaged, working the weapon with practiced ease. They were focused on the ridge, on the loud, obvious targets. They never thought to look behind them. The drone feed in the talk showed her disappear into a deep crevice of rock 20 meters from the nest. The operators held their breath. For 2 minutes there was nothing. Then the camera zoomed in. A flicker of movement. Rostova emerged from the shadows directly behind the 2 men. She was a wraith. One moment she was not there, the next she was. There were 2 short, muffled coughs from the honey badger, sounds no louder than a car door closing. The 2 figures crumpled over their weapon without a sound. She didn't pause to admire her work. She took the enemy's radio, listened for a moment, and then moved on, a predator thinning the herd. She used the terrain and the enemy's own fire patterns to mask her movements, flowing from one position to the next. 2 more enemy riflemen, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, went down in the same ghostly fashion. A short burst of suppressed fire. Silence. She was not fighting a battle. She was solving a problem, systematically removing variables from an equation. With the pressure on them suddenly lifted, Thorne's team was able to rally. The storm of bullets that had kept them pinned had dwindled to sporadic, panicked shots. Thorne, confused but seizing the opportunity, directed his men to lay down a heavy base of fire, driving the remaining ambushers back. He thought a support element had arrived. He had no idea his salvation had come in the form of the woman he had dismissed as a librarian. Rostova, her work done, did not join the firefight. Her objective was the junction box. While Thorne's team engaged the now disorganized remnants of the enemy force, she slipped away, melting back into the wadi. She reached the gray metal box. It was scarred by shrapnel, but intact. The main armored conduit leading to it had been severed by a deliberate, precise explosive charge. She knelt, opened her own diagnostic kit, and went to work. Her hands moved with a surgeon's grace. She bypassed the damaged conduit, spliced delicate fiber optic strands that were thinner than human hair, and rerouted power from a backup source. Her fingers danced across the small keyboard of her diagnostic unit, lines of code scrolling across the screen. In the TOC, the red question mark over Gamma 7 flickered. Then it turned yellow. Then green. The sensor feed came back online, flooding the screens with tactical data. The entire process had taken her less than 90 seconds. Her task complete, she packed her tools. She did not radio in her success. The green lights on the command screen were her report. She simply stood, slung the honey badger over her shoulder, and began the silent, solitary walk back to the FOB, a ghost returning to the machine, leaving a baffled gunnery sergeant on a ridge behind her, wondering where the hell his guardian angels had come from. The impossible had been made routine. The silence in the Tactical Operations Center was absolute. Every eye was fixed on the main screen, where the sensor grid for Section Gamma 7 glowed with a healthy solid green. Data streamed in. Thermal signatures of the retreating hostiles, seismic footprints of Thorne's team beginning their cautious withdrawal, acoustic pings of distant fading gunfire. It was a resurrection. A corner of their world, once dark and dead, was alive again with information. The operators, comms specialists, and intelligence analysts stood in stunned reverence. They had just witnessed a miracle performed with code and quiet competence. The door to the TOC hissed open, and Specialist Rostova stepped inside. She was coated in a fine layer of dust, which seemed to cling to her like a second skin, the only evidence of her journey into the Valley of Death. She moved with the same unhurried, economical grace, walking directly to the comms rack where she had left her diagnostic kit. She placed the honey badger on the table with a soft click, a gesture of finality, and began to methodically clean her tools. She seemed utterly unaffected by what had just transpired, as if she had just returned from a routine maintenance check. A few moments later, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and his team stumbled in, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, their eyes wide with the lingering shock of combat. Thorne looked from the glowing green map to the calm, unassuming figure of Rostova. His mind struggled to connect the two realities, the vicious, overwhelming ambush he had barely survived, and the quiet technician who had supposedly walked through it untouched. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but no words came out. His bluster, his certainty, his entire worldview had been fractured. It was then that Colonel Vance moved. He walked past the humbled, speechless gunnery sergeant without a glance. He walked past the gawking junior officers and enlisted men. He stopped directly in front of Specialist Rostova, who paused her work and stood to face him, her expression as neutral as ever. The entire room held its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, the unspoken question of who this woman truly was hanging over them all. Vance's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it commanded the total and complete attention of every person in the room. It was the voice of history being recorded. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers before returning to Rostova, "this is not Specialist Rostova. That is a temporary designation she uses for administrative purposes while she is attached to conventional units." He let the statement hang in the air, allowing the confusion to deepen. Thorne stared, his mind reeling. A temporary designation. "Her real name is Anya Rostova," Vance continued, his tone taking on a reverent quality. "But her operational file name is Ghost. She is a member of a very specialized, very quiet unit that doesn't officially exist. They are the ones we send when all other options have failed. They are the architects of the systems you use every day." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He pointed a finger at the main tactical screen. "Specialist Rostova," he said, the word now sounding like a deliberate understatement, "is the lead designer of the Cerberus 3 sensor system. She wrote 500,000 lines of its source code. She knows its weaknesses because she designed its strengths. The ambushers who took down the Gamma 7 array didn't find a flaw in the system. They used a specific countermeasure that was theorized in her own doctoral thesis on network vulnerabilities. She didn't just walk into their trap, she walked into a problem of her own creation." A collective gasp, soft but audible, went through the room. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. The librarian, the IT nerd. She hadn't just fixed the system, she was the system. Vance wasn't finished. He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, as if sharing a sacred story. 5 years ago, during the initial push into Marja, a small reconnaissance patrol was compromised and surrounded in a poppy field. They were outnumbered 10-1. Their communications were down, air support was blind, and their exfil route was cut off. A quick reaction force was sent in, but they were pinned down a click away. It was a death sentence. He looked around the room, ensuring everyone was listening. A single figure, armed with nothing but a sidearm, a knife, and a signals jammer, moved through 300 meters of open terrain under heavy machine gun and RPG fire. This figure neutralized the enemy command element, restored the patrol's comms, and then single-handedly dismantled the enemy's flanking positions. The entire engagement, from the moment she broke cover to the moment the enemy broke and ran, lasted 40 seconds. 40 seconds. When the QRF finally pushed through, they found her standing over the wounded patrol leader, applying a tourniquet, the only one still on her feet. That was the first time the name Ghost appeared in an after-action report. He turned back to Rostova, his eyes filled with a profound respect. She is not a soldier, she is not a technician, she is a force of nature, and you, he said, finally turning his piercing gaze upon Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. You called her sweetheart. The public humiliation was complete. Thorne stood there, stripped bare, his arrogance and condescension laid out for all to see as the pathetic ignorance it was. The command logs on the screen were a silent testament to his failure, displaying his panicked calls for help next to the serene, steady green of Rostova's success. He had led his men into a trap she had predicted. He had failed where she had succeeded. His authority, built on a foundation of volume and swagger, had crumbled into dust. He felt the weight of every eye in the room on him, not with pity, but with a cold, unforgiving judgment. He was a fraud, exposed by the very person he had sought to diminish. Colonel Vance's attention remained fixed on the gunnery sergeant, his expression one of cold, profound disappointment. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "Your performance today was not just a failure of tactics. It was a failure of leadership. You allowed your ego to endanger the lives of your men and compromise the security of this base. You ignored sound intelligence from a subject matter expert because you couldn't see past her rank and gender. You are a liability." Vance didn't wait for a response. He turned to the sergeant major standing near the door. "Sergeant Major, relieve Gunnery Sergeant Thorne of his command of the Force Recon Platoon, effective immediately. He is confined to quarters pending a full review of this incident. Find me a leader who knows how to listen." The order was delivered with the finality of a guillotine. It was a clinical, professional execution of a career. Thorne could only nod, his face ashen, the strength seeming to drain from his massive frame. He had been broken, not in battle, but by a quiet truth. Then, Colonel Vance did something that sealed the moment in the institutional memory of everyone present. He turned his back on the disgraced gunnery sergeant and faced Rostova once more. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up in a salute so crisp, so precise, it seemed to slice the air. It was not the casual salute between officers. It was the formal, reverent salute reserved for a Medal of Honor recipient or a visiting general. It was a gesture of profound, unconditional respect, an act of institutional validation that transcended rank and protocol. It was the establishment, in the form of a full-bird colonel, bowing to true competence. Anya Rostova, the ghost, looked at the colonel for a long moment. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant motion, she returned the salute. Her gesture was just as perfect, a mirror image of his own. In that shared moment of silence, a new order was established. The old hierarchy of loud arrogance had been shattered, replaced by an unspoken reverence for the quiet professional. The lesson was complete. The story of what happened in the TOC and the Wadi of Gamma 7 spread through FOB Nightingale like a brush fire. It was told in hushed tones in the chow hall, debated over lukewarm coffee in maintenance bays, and whispered in the darkness of guard towers. It became a legend, a cautionary tale for the arrogant and an inspiration for the overlooked. The incident was quickly mythologized, its details polished and enhanced with each retelling until it took on the quality of a modern epic. The specific cleft of rock where junction box J7 was housed became an unofficial landmark, referred to only as Rostova's Perch. Young Marines on patrol would point it out, speaking of the ghost who walked through a kill zone and fixed the unfixable. The Honey Badger rifle, which Chief Erickson had quietly returned to his own armory, was cleaned and placed in a display case in the SEAL team's ready room. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was affixed, engraved with a single word, Ghost. The event itself was written up, classified, and sent to Quantico, where it became a case study at the Leadership Academy on the catastrophic dangers of ego and the critical importance of listening to expertise, regardless of its source. The lesson was being institutionalized. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, humbled and broken, was not sent home in disgrace. Colonel Vance, in a final act of wisdom, understood that a lesson wasted was worse than no lesson at all. After a week of confinement and reflection, Thorne was reassigned. He became an instructor for pre-deployment training, his new mission to teach young NCOs about situational awareness, not just on the battlefield, but within their own teams. His primary teaching tool was his own failure. He would stand before squads of eager, confident corporals and sergeants and tell the story of the quiet specialist he called Sweetheart. He told it without ego, without excuse, presenting his own arrogance as the primary antagonist of the tale. He became a quieter man, his voice losing its bombastic edge. He learned to listen, to observe, to value the quiet ones in the corner. His redemption was not in regaining his former glory, but in becoming the primary guardian of the lesson he had learned so painfully. He even sought out Rostova once, before she was reassigned, and offered a short, direct apology. She had simply nodded, accepting it as another data point, and continued with her work. And Anya Rostova. She remained indifferent to her own legend, the fame, the whispers, the awe-filled stares she now received as she walked through the FOB. It was all just noise, irrelevant data that had no bearing on her work. She finished her system-wide audit of Nightingale's defenses, filed her report, and then, as quietly as she arrived, she was gone. Her legacy was not the single dramatic event, but the subtle positive shift in the culture she left behind. She had corrected a flaw in the system, not just the technical one in the Wadi, but the human one in the command structure. She continued her silent, essential work elsewhere, a ghost in the global machine, forever ensuring that the shield was strong, the data was pure, and that true strength would always be measured not by the volume of a voice, but by the quiet perfection of a result. She was and always would be the quiet professional.